All right, so have you ever like stopped and thought about what would make you march for miles in the pouring rain just to demand bread?
Like, what would push you that far?
Yeah, like what would get you to that point, you know?
Right.
But well, that's exactly what happened in 1789 France.
Wow.
It all culminated in an event that we know today as the March on Versailles.
Okay.
So today, on our deep dive, we are diving into this like really pivotal moment,
Yeah.
and we're going to be looking at how fear and rumors and just like economic hardship in general can totally just shake the foundations of power.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to see how quickly the situation in France just like fell apart, after the storming of the Bastille and the Declaration of the Rights of Man.
Yeah, it seems like such a turning point, right? Like you have this moment of hope, and then just a few months later, things just completely fall apart. So, like,
Right.
what happened?
Yeah, it's like it went from hope to despair so quickly.
Yeah. Well, I think
Yeah.
while like the declaration was a huge step, like monumental,
It left this like really big question that was just kind of hanging out there.
which is,
What about the king?
oh, yeah.
Like, what was his role in this new France? It was super unclear, and his hesitancy to really get on board with all the changes, I think, just fueled public distrust.
Yeah. Like people were probably thinking, like, okay, what are you doing?
Totally, like, is he with us or against us?
Yeah.
And that was a big problem.
The sources actually mentioned like a veto misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Can you sort of unpack that for us?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the big debate was all about whether the king should have, like, absolute veto power, like total control.
Over everything.
Yeah, over the National Assembly's decisions. And he was really hesitant to give that up completely,
Right.
which a lot of people saw as like a betrayal.
Yeah, especially in Paris, right?
Exactly. In Paris, especially, they felt like he was clinging to the old ways,
Right.
not willing to really embrace the new France.
It's like he wanted to have his cake and eat it too.
Kinda, yeah.
So you've got this like backdrop of all this political uncertainty.
Right.
And then as if things weren't bad enough,
Totally.
the economy just throws gasoline on the
Yeah,
fire.
yeah, it all just explodes.
Tell me about the economic situation. What were people dealing with?
Well, Paris was really struggling, like really struggling.
Okay.
The price of bread, which, is like the most basic food.
Right. Like if bread's expensive, everything's expensive.
Exactly.
Right.
It just skyrocketed. People were hungry and they were angry.
Makes sense.
And then into this like super volatile mixed steps, Jean-Paul Marat,
Oh, yeah.
a journalist with a serious talent for like really inflammatory rhetoric.
Yeah, he knew how to get a rise out of people.
Oh, for sure.
So this is the guy behind the newspaper, L'Ami du Peuple.
Right. The people's friend. Yeah.
That's ironic, isn't it?
You could say that.
Okay, so what was Marat doing to make things worse?
Well, he was a master at tapping into people's anxieties, especially in Paris. His articles, I mean, they were powerful. He painted this picture of like a corrupt elite who were just hoarding all the wealth
Right.
and like deliberately starving the people just to like undermine the revolution.
So he was painted them as the enemy.
Oh, yeah, he called them like bloodsuckers and stuff.
Wow.
It was intense.
And people believed him.
They did. His words had a really powerful effect.
It almost sounds like he was like purposely trying to make things worse and stir up trouble, you know?
You could definitely argue that. I mean, was he a provocateur?
Right.
Absolutely. But we also have to remember that his words had so much power because they reflected what people were already feeling.
Right.
Like that fear and anger was already there, simmering beneath the surface.
So he was just like the voice of the people's rage.
In a way, yeah. He gave them a target for their anger.
So we've got economic hardship, political instability,
Right.
and a guy like Marat just fanning the flames of discontent.
It's a recipe for disaster.
What was the thing that finally set everything off?
It was a scandal, a banquet at Versailles.
A banquet.
Yeah, sounds harmless, right? But it became like a symbol for everything the people in Paris hated about the monarchy.
Okay, let's hear about this banquet. What happened?
On the surface, it was just a party, right? A banquet hosted by the king's bodyguards for the Flanders Regiment.
Who are the Flanders Regiment?
They were a key military unit, super loyal to the king.
Okay, so it was a party for the king's people.
Basically, yeah. But the problem was the timing. I mean, Paris was starving.
Right.
People were struggling to survive.
And they're having a party.
Exactly.
So it sounds like the optics were really bad.
Oh, yeah, it was a PR nightmare.
So you've got the people in Paris barely scraping by. And meanwhile, the elites at Versailles are just like feasting and celebrating.
Yeah, like they were completely out of touch.
Totally.
And then, to make things even worse, rumors started flying.
What kind of rumors?
Oh, wild stuff. People were saying it was an orgy.
An orgy?
Yeah, and that the guests were like trampling on the revolutionary cockade. Some even said that the queen had like thrown breadcrumbs on the floor for the poor to eat.
Jeez, like as a joke.
It was awful.
Wow, that's crazy.
The thing is, it almost doesn't even matter if it was true or not.
Yeah, perception is reality.
Exactly. It's all about how it was perceived, and the people of Paris saw it as a slap in the face.
And like the banquet itself wasn't the problem, but it was like what it represented.
Right, exactly.
Like a symbol of how detached the monarchy was from the people and their struggles.
Totally. And Marat, he didn't miss a beat.
Of course not.
He published all these scathing accounts in L'Ami du Peuple.
Just pouring gasoline on the fire.
Oh, yeah. Big time. And that just fueled the outrage even more.
So this banquet and Marat's reporting pushed the people of Paris to their breaking point.
Things were about to get real.
And on October 5th, a group of women, the fishwives of the marketplace, decided they'd had enough.
Yeah, they were done.
Can you set the scene for us?
Imagine thousands of women, just furious and desperate,
Wow.
marching for miles in the pouring rain.
Wow. Armed with whatever they could find. Sticks, knives, even cannons.
Cannons? Where'd they get cannons?
They picked them up along the way.
Really?
Yeah, they were serious. And they set off for Versailles. Their goal was to demand bread from the king and force him to come back to Paris.
This is incredible, isn't it? Like these women who are normally just ignored or even ridiculed,
Yeah.
suddenly they become this powerful force to be reckoned with.
Exactly. They were not messing around.
They were not.
And what's fascinating is how they gained support along the way. Like it just kept growing.
Really?
Yeah, shopkeepers, laborers, even some of the king's own soldiers joined them.
Wow. So this wasn't just a few angry women. It was a whole movement.
It was a groundswell of anger and frustration with the whole system.
This is intense.
Oh, yeah. And it just goes to show how unpredictable revolutions can be.
Right.
What starts as a bread riot can turn into a challenge to the entire power structure.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's amazing, really. It's like a wildfire, once it gets going.
Totally. There's no stopping it.
And in the middle of all of this is the Marquis de Lafayette.
Oh, yeah. Lafayette.
Head of the National Guard, remember?
Right. Trying to keep everything from falling apart.
Exactly. But he's stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah. He's got to be loyal to the king, but he's also got sympathy for these revolutionaries.
Totally. The sources paint him as like this really conflicted figure.
Oh, I bet. He's got a tough job.
Yeah, I mean, he's supposed to maintain order in Paris.
Right.
But then he's basically forced to follow this mob all the way to Versailles.
Because his own troops are joining them.
Exactly. They're swept up in the revolutionary fervor. And Lafayette kind of becomes the symbol of how out of control everything is.
Right. Like the revolution is taking on a life of its own.
Totally. It's bigger than any one person at this point.
So the women, they get to Versailles first.
Yeah, they're the first ones there.
And they want to see the king.
Demanding to see him.
What happens when they get to the palace?
Well, they try to force their way in, of course. But the king's guards are holding them back.
Right.
But they're not giving up, so they end up storming the National Assembly instead.
Oh, wow. I bet that was a scene.
It was wild.
What was it like inside the assembly?
It's almost funny to picture, you've got all these deputies
Right.
all dressed up in their fancy clothes.
Yeah, these guys are used to like order and decorum.
Exactly. They're used to debating and stuff.
Right.
And suddenly this mob of women just bursts in, soaking wet and furious.
Talk about a disruption.
Oh, yeah. They were shouting, rummaging through stuff,
Really?
basically turning the place upside down.
So like, what did they do?
Well, in the middle of all this chaos, they pick this young flower girl.
A flower girl.
Yeah, her name was Pierrette Chabry.
Oh.
They want her to speak to the king.
Why a flower girl?
She was young, innocent.
How old was she?
17.
Wow, 17.
They saw her as like the opposite of the queen.
Right, who was like the villain in all of this.
Exactly. So they thought she'd make a good impression on the king.
Okay, so this flower girl, she gets brought before the king.
She does, and she's completely overwhelmed by the whole thing.
I can only imagine.
She faints.
Really?
Yeah, right there in front of him.
Talk about a dramatic entrance.
Sure. But the king, he revives her, promises to try and get them some bread.
Okay.
And for a minute, things seem like they might calm down.
Right.
But then Lafayette shows up with the National Guard.
Oh, boy. That's when things really change, right?
Yeah, up until this point, it's mostly symbolic.
Right.
The women were one thing, but the National Guard.
That's a real military force.
Exactly. That's when things get serious.
And that puts Lafayette in an even tougher spot, right?
Oh, absolutely. He's leading the very force that could overthrow the king.
Wow. That's a lot of pressure.
It is, and as he's entering the palace,
Yeah.
one of the courtiers says to him, "There goes Oliver Cromwell."
Oh, wow.
And Lafayette, he replies, "Cromwell would not have come unarmed."
That's chilling.
It really is, right? Like, what does that mean?
It makes you wonder, could Lafayette have become like a Cromwell figure?
Yeah, could he have seized power if he wanted to?
Did he have the ambition, the ruthlessness?
It's a good question. Historians still argue about it.
What do you think?
Well, he definitely had the opportunity, that's for sure.
Yeah, he had the support, the military force.
He did, but ultimately I think Lafayette was more of a compromiser, trying to hold everything together even though the revolution was tearing it all apart.
Yeah, that's a tough position to be in.
So Lafayette, he tells the king he has to go back to Paris.
What does Louis say?
Well, at first he resists, of course.
He doesn't want to go.
No, but he can see what's happening. The mob's outside, the National Guard is there.
Right, he's not in control anymore.
Exactly. And then just when you think things can't get crazier,
Yeah.
the mob breaks into the palace.
No way.
Yeah, they're after the queen.
This is where things get really dark.
It is. This is like the ugly side of revolutions,
Yeah.
All that desperation and fear and anger.
Right.
It boils over into violence.
So they break into the queen's apartments.
They do, and they kill her bodyguards.
Oh my God.
It's brutal.
What happens to Marie Antoinette?
She manages to escape through a secret passageway.
Wow.
She flees in her nightgown, barefoot, terrified.
That's awful.
It really is. It shows how real the danger was.
So Lafayette gets the king back to Paris, but at a huge cost.
Yeah, there's been bloodshed, the queen's traumatized, the mob is still out of control.
So what does he do? How does he restore order?
Well, it's chaos. But Lafayette, he somehow manages to take control again.
So he's good at this.
He is. He really is. He calms the mob, stops the violence, and convinces Louis and Marie that the only way to get the people off their backs is to appear before them.
So the king and queen, after almost getting killed, have to face the mob that wanted them dead.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
What happens?
So they agree to go back to Paris, right?
Right.
But Lafayette wants to make a show of it, a big gesture of reconciliation. So he takes a cockade.
Like the symbol of the revolution.
Right, and he pins it to the hat of one of the king's bodyguards.
Wow, that's a powerful image, for sure. Was it genuine or just for show, you think?
That's a tough one to answer,
Yeah.
But either way, it worked, at least for a little while.
So they go out on the balcony?
Well, the king does at first,
Okay.
but the people, they still want the queen.
They see her as the enemy.
She's like the symbol of everything they hate about the monarchy.
Right.
So they demand she comes out too.
Which must have been terrifying for her, after what just happened.
Oh, absolutely. She's probably still shaken up,
Yeah.
but she does it. She goes out there alone, facing that angry mob.
Wow.
It's quiet for a minute, and then they start chanting, "Vive la reine!"
Long live the queen.
Yeah, Lafayette did it again.
Turn the tide. I mean, was that all part of the plan?
He was good at what he did. There's no doubt about that.
But it's a temporary fix, right?
Yeah, there's still this underlying tension, even with Lafayette's charisma.
So they go back to Paris, but it's not exactly a happy ending.
No, it's more like a funeral procession, actually.
The sources described it as that. Yeah.
They ride in their carriage. Behind them are these wagons filled with flour they took from Versailles, and leading the way, the heads of their murdered bodyguards.
Oh, wow, that's brutal.
It really is a stark reminder that this is a revolution and things are getting messy.
Yeah.
The monarchy is basically a prisoner now, completely stripped of power.
What a fall from grace.
It's crazy to think about.
The sources mention the Dauphin, the king's son, complaining about his room in the Tuileries Palace.
Yeah, just a small detail, but it really says a lot.
They've gone from Versailles to that.
It's symbolic of their whole situation, Everything's changed.
So these October days, as we call them,
Yeah.
they really shifted things in France.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
The monarchy, they're weakened. The National Assembly, they're emboldened. And the radicals are gaining more and more influence.
Yeah, it feels like things are really starting to unravel.
Exactly. And the question of the monarchy's role, it's still unanswered, which means more trouble down the line.
So we've seen how economic troubles, political games, and just plain rumors led to this march on Versailles.
That's a wild story.
It really is. But looking back, could it have been avoided? What if the king had just made some different choices? What if Lafayette had really embraced the revolution?
It's hard to say for sure. It's one of those historical what-ifs.
Right.
Some people say the march was bound to happen, a clash between the old and the new.
Like destiny almost.
Yeah, but others think that things could have played out differently, you know?
With different choices, different personalities maybe.
Exactly, but that's history for you, full of possibilities and what-ifs.
It makes you think about how the smallest actions can have huge consequences.
That's a great takeaway, for sure.
So why does all this matter to us today, this march that happened over 200 years ago?
It's a reminder that power can shift, that institutions can be toppled.
No matter how powerful they seem.
Exactly. And it shows how dangerous fear and rumors can be.
Especially when you throw in economic problems and political uncertainty.
Totally, like that banquet at Versailles with all those rumors and Marat's reporting. It created this atmosphere of fear and suspicion that led to violence.
It's scary to think about how easily people can be manipulated by misinformation, even today.
It is, and I think the March on Versailles also shows us how important our individual choices are.
Like every decision matters.
Yeah, even in the middle of all these historical forces, the choices of individuals like Lafayette, Marat, the king, the queen, even those market women, they all shaped what happened.
It's a reminder that we have the power to make a difference.
Absolutely. And as we learn about history, we have to remember the human element, the hopes and fears that the people who lived through these events.
That's a great point. I think that's a good place to wrap things up.
Yeah, sounds good.
Well, that's our deep dive into the March on Versailles.
A pivotal moment in the French Revolution.
Absolutely. We've seen how it happened, who the players were, and the impact it had on history.
It's a story that still resonates today.
Thanks for joining us. And we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the fascinating world of history.